Okay, we're done. So that was good. The whole climate change issue dealt with and tidied up. Did you want to say anything? Do you have any comments on anybody else's presentation, or do you want to release these poor folks back into the wild?
I'm sure someone else has some questions.
Come on.
Yeah,
what do you always wanted to ask a climate scientist?
Perhaps this is overly general a question, but as a layperson kind of coming into, let's say, a conference like this or reading Conrad Black's lovely newspaper, sometimes I feel a little bit lost between what's a modest estimate, a conservative estimate. Is there anything that functions as essentially a normal case scenario scoreboard for how we're doing as a species in custody of our planet?
That's a great idea. We should have such a thing. I don't think such a thing exists, but that's really good. Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, like, what's conservative, what's normal, what's expected. These things change day by day, and when people use these words, you often have no idea what they actually mean. So having a quantified thing where you could actually say exactly what these things meant and how we were doing, I think would be a great idea.
I interpreted your question a little bit differently, which is, where do you go for information that might be sort of middle of the road or more.
Oh, okay. Well, that's it.
I mean, that's a really, in today's day and age, there's information everywhere, and you can pull things off the internet with impunity, and so it is important to think about where you get your information. I think as a scientific community, first of all, a lot of scientists work, Gavin is a good example of someone who works to communicate his knowledge as a scientist to the lay public through things like blogs. But I think, one of the best bets is to go to agencies and organizations where what their findings represent is a broad consensus within the scientific community. And, I mentioned the IPCC. A lot of us think of some of the things that the IPCC reports as conservative. If you imagine trying to get 2,000 scientists to agree on certain points, you might imagine that they can agree on certain things that are unassailable and other things that they leave as still being discussed. And one of the examples of that was in the 2007 report, when they reported on sea level rise. And at the time, there were a lot of things that were emerging about the dynamics of ice sheets and how they melt under global warming scenarios. But it was still research that was being worked out and refined. And what the report and what the scientists decided to do was only report on the sea level rise associated with the expansion due to the warming of the oceans, to mention the fact that these dynamic features were out there, but not include them in their official sea level rise estimates. And that's a very clear example of a situation where what was reported was a very conservative projection of what the sea level rise was expected to be. And the science since that time has evolved and matured, and it's been revised upwards by 50 to 100%. So the sea level rise projections at that point were conservative. The point being is that I think that if you really want the consensus view, go to the scientific organizations, go to the IPCC, these places where they represent a broad consensus of the scientific community, and put less weight on individual opinions and reporting, because I think that everyone has a perspective, but it's very important to build consensus.
I was just going to add the national academies do a really good job on that kind of stuff. So don't read don't believe what you read on my blog, but read what the national academies say. They do very good jobs.
Alan Savory gave a TED talk regarding increase in desertification, and has also increased the climate, increased the weather. And I was just wondering your take on that, like if we increase grasslands, do you really believe that has a change in climate?
There's not an awful lot of evidence that modification of the land surface causes a significantly strong effect on the climate above it. There are a few exceptions. The Dust Bowl is one, which was one of the United States in the 1930s was one of the most significant human-induced perturbations to a land surface that has ever occurred, and it seems to have had a clear intensification of the drought. But the more commonly asserted one is the Sahel of Africa, the southern shore of the Sahara Desert, where the whole idea of desertification was originally induced by an eminent MIT meteorologist, Jules Charney. We now know that doesn't seem to have really had the impact of grazing and transformation of the savanna region there by farmers and people herding livestock. Doesn't seem to have had a significant effect, and in fact that's a region where there was a trend towards drier conditions from the 60s through to the 90s, and it's now been largely reversed and people have moved back. The landscape there, the vegetation seems to be able to respond remarkably quickly to changes in precipitation. So land surface changes and impacts on atmosphere, it's still something that is being looked at a lot, but relative to, say, the influence that ocean conditions have on climate around the world, I would say it is small. And I can tell Gavin's itching to disagree with me.
Well, no, I'm not going to disagree completely. I think you're right. The savanna margins, like planting grasses and the rain following the grass, right? That I agree is not very well supported. But like large scale deforestation in the Amazon, that does have an impact. It has an impact on water recycling. It has an impact on rainfall. The deforestation in Europe that occurred mainly, now many hundreds of years ago, had an impact on climate. The deforestation of the U.S. and the reforestation after the population crash when Columbus, after Columbus discovered Hispaniola, those things did have impacts on climate. They're detectable, but in terms of like how big they are compared to the changes that we're seeing because of greenhouse gases, it's small. I mean, it's interesting scientifically, but of kind of a second order in terms of where we're going.
I think there's a vast population of our leadership, global and national, and a vast population of global and national constituents who simply don't understand this. Today's analogy to baseball is like a mind opener because it's a handy implement for informing the public at large. It would be very nice to engage our public to become part of the future in this particular way. Perhaps it would help.
So absolutely, that analogy actually, the weather on steroids, actually gets a lot of play in the press the last few months, and you're right. It is, people understand these things when you speak in terms of metaphors that are appropriate quite handily. I think the bigger problem that we have in talking to the public, though, is that the public have lots of other things on their minds, right? That they're worrying about their paycheck, they're worrying about unemployment, their health benefits, their house which has been flooded. There's a lot of demands on people's attention. What are the Kardashians doing today? That's very important. So we're not as interesting as that in some sense. I think we're more important. This issue is more important, but people don't always want to be thinking about important things, and so finding ways to break through into people's kind of self-imposed bubbles is tough. Yeah, but then you get accused of propagandizing, and then you just get, and then that undermines your credibility as a scientist, So there's only so much you can do there. But people are trying in all sorts of different ways. I mean, I'm certainly doing my best, and these guys are doing their best, and lots of other people within the community are also doing a lot more in terms of outreach at all different levels, at the city level, at the public level, at church levels, at the federal government level. We're making progress, but it's slow and it isn't enough.
I would put it slightly differently to the way you did, because I think the public is, if anything, more concerned and aware and concerned with these issues than government leaders are. at least federal level government leaders are. So, when you look at, when you ask people whether they believe global warming is real and whether humans are responsible for it, the responses come back and they are completely predictable based on ideological lines. It's, you know, it's an overwhelming majority.
Only in the US?
In the US.
In
the US. It's an overwhelming majority of people who vote Democratic, and it's a minority of people who vote Republican. So, and the Republicans actually tend to have higher levels of education than Democrats, actually, because they're wealthier. So it doesn't, whether people believe in global warming and look at the scientific evidence and think it's something of concern and something that humans are responsible for, has no correlation with their education level whatsoever. So what people are believing is being dictated a priori by what they want the answer to be. And you know, climate science is not the only thing like that. Economics is another one. And so I think it's, you know, just knowledge transfer is in and of itself, and explaining the science in and of itself is not going to get us to a solution.
I think we all have our opinions on this. I agree with everything that's been said. I also think it's not entirely accurate to think about this as a vacuum, where if scientists would just step forward to fill it, it would solve the problem, whether through different ways of communication. And we all have work to do to think about how to communicate our science more effectively to the lay public, and I'm in complete support with that. But the fact is that it's not a vacuum. There's actually a lot of noise out there. It's not just the Kardashians. There's a lot of noise with regard to the way people look at the actual science. And Gavin showed some good examples of figures that were misleading. And I think that what exists out there in terms of confusion, and the gentleman that asked about where do I go for appropriately sourced information, it's a really hard task to actually establish, to cut through the noise with the principal message about what we know, what we understand, and what the threats are. And so I wouldn't excuse us from having a big job to do, and I think that we absolutely have to engage, but I think we also have to acknowledge that there are a lot of other things, either randomly or by design, that make our message in some cases difficult to get out because of how much noise and argument there is out there by people who are either doing it honestly or not.
The central issue is that the vast population is simply scientifically illiterate. And I remember years ago, the Federal Reserve Bank produced cartoons for children and adults. But you need to be on the So my point is there is a way, there are vehicles to kindly nudge the population into engagement and productive support for implementation.
Thank you.
You mentioned that the drought. Oh, there it is. That the drought cost taxpayers $30 billion. Was that right?
Yeah, something like that.
My question is, where do those dollars go? Are they to subsidize the farmers' losses, or where does that money go? And two, who's bearing the brunt of those crop yields decreasing? Basically, no one's going hungry in a first world country, but where's that lack of food going?
Well, no one goes not many people go hungry in the United States, but there was a huge drop in crop production within the United States in 2011, and then last year in 2012. There is a plot of that. I mean, it's a remarkable outlier. The amount of lost production for corn in 2012 was equivalent to the total US production in around about 1960s. So it was a lot. And there's a system of federally backed crop insurance that farmers buy into, and there's a payout for that. However, there's not enough money went into it in order to pay out this, and that's always the case. So the tab just falls on the federal tax bill, the taxpayer. So that's how that money, and it just goes directly to farmers. So farmers within the United States will not see much of a drop in farm income during a drought when their crops fail, because the lost income is compensated for by federal payouts. And you can argue whether that's a good system or a bad system, but it's the way that it has worked here for a back. I mean, this is a system that was initially set up after the 1930s Dust Bowl drought, which in many ways was like a bifurcation point in the social and economic history of much of the U.S. agricultural production.
Hi there, guys. I have a question. It's not necessarily my viewpoint, but it's one that I do read about, and I'm just curious, since we have three esteemed climate scientists here, what your opinions might be on this.
Where are they?
So let's say that I'm someone that yes, I agree with all this, but so what? I think that 100 years from now we'll just adapt, migrate. More people will live in the northern latitudes, and generally I think everyone will just be slightly better off in a warmer planet. What's the response to something like that from the experts?
So if we were starting out and we had our whole civilization to build again, and the world was going to have the climate that we anticipate in 2100, we would make different decisions. We would not put quite so much infrastructure near the waterline. We would have adjusted where we're growing grapes and corn and tilling soils and chopping down forests and all of these things. And and we'd pretty much go on the way we were. But that's not the situation. The situation is not whether a warmer climate is intrinsically better than a colder climate. You're right. We would just adapt to that. The problem is that we've invested in the climate that we have. We've invested trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars in anticipation of where the shoreline is. Right? And we saw that very clearly with Sandy and Katrina. We have invested very heavily in the kinds of houses that we build in certain climates, the kinds of heating systems and air conditioning systems that we build, the kinds of crop services that we have. All of these things exist because we had a climate that allowed these things to exist. They were based on expectations that climate was not going to change very much. Those expectations are changing. And that's why we have a problem, because moving to that mythical world where we're totally happy in a 4-degree, 5-degree warmed world is not going to be free. Right? Ask Bloomberg how much the costs of a barrage across the Verrazano Narrows is going to be. Ask the people on the other side of that barrage whether they want that to be there, because every time there's a flood, it's going to make their floods worse, even while it's saving Lower Manhattan. Ask the Venetians how much the Mose project is. Ask the Bangladeshis what they're going to do, because they're not going to build a barrage. Where are the 100 million people that live within 1 meter of sea level going to move to, right? And that's a lot of people, and in parts of the world that are not necessarily the most open and welcoming to literally hordes of newcomers. So the costs of this, the issue here is not, how can we get as fast to the sunny uplands that one might imagine as possible, but what that transition is going to be, and who's going to be suffering there, and what the consequences there is for our cultural heritage, for our human capital, for all sorts of things along those lines.
I would add that obviously a country like the United States or Western Europe, wealthy countries are going to be able to some extent adjust. There are engineering solutions to a lot of this, but the impacts of climate change are not geographically spread equally. Jason showed the maps of future temperatures in Africa, for example, and that came from a study, one of many studies about how is it that tropical agriculture is going to adapt to temperatures that high. You can't breed crops for temperatures that they have never seen in their whole history of evolution. That's very difficult to do. So there's a real threat of, for example, serious declines in tropical agricultural productivity. Now, Africans have done nothing to create this problem, but will be amongst the people who are, who are going to experience the most severe consequences. And similarly, when you look at the changes in hydroclimate and the aridification of the Middle East or Northern Africa, some of those places will probably become uninhabitable because of drying and a depletion of water resources. And right now, we live in a world where migration from those countries to the better able to adapt climate countries in more northern latitudes is already restricted, and I don't see anything changing that is going to allow an extra several million climate refugees be able to migrate out of the countries that have suffered the worst consequences of human activities that they had nothing to do with. So that's certainly not that may be the world that we are going to, but I certainly don't think it's something that I look forward to at all.
And our last word?
I don't know if I'm going to take the last word, but I just want to, the thing I think of as far as this goes is, think of a mountain. Think of the species that have adapted to the different bands of the mountain. If you're the species at the top of the mountain where you've adapted to a certain amount of cold temperatures and precipitation, and things warm, the snow line moves up and the temperatures increase. If you're at the top of the mountain, it's not a good place to be because you don't have anywhere else to go. And that's what exists for a lot of people throughout the world as the world warms and what they're going to be able to adjust to, whether it's through sea level rises or changes in temperatures, etc. The other thing, so in some senses, it's a privileged position to make that argument, because if you have adaptation capabilities, chances are you will adapt to some degree and make those adaptations in a way that will mitigate or at least reduce the impacts that you experience. But I think that you can also make the argument from a privileged position just by doing a cost-benefit analysis, just by looking at the risks we face and the options that we have in front of us. Yes, we can put the throttle forward, just speed on in the direction that we're going, and we may get there, which might be a problem. By virtue of the fact that we will suffer a lot of the impacts if we continue going in this direction. Some of the other options are not just about mitigating this problem, but also mean cleaner energies, more equitable energies, more resilient infrastructures to many of the different climatic changes that exist just through internal variability. And so I think when you actually add those things up and you look at the risks and the things that we face in addition to what we could actually achieve if we made sensible responses to this, both in reducing our emissions and finding additional energy supplies and taking advantage of those, I think by far, even from a privileged position, it makes a lot more sense to take these risks seriously and build smartly and invest in alternatives.
Okay, we have to wrap it up now, but thank you very much for coming. And having these interactions at the end is actually far more interesting for us than giving our own opinions again and again and again. So thank you very much for that, and I wish you all the best, and maybe we'll see you at the next one of these seminars. When was the next one? Yeah, April 4th. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to you guys.
Because I tend to dance around and it's going to be more comfortable for me. I jumped in front of Richard because I wanted to save the best for last, of course, but I also think that there's a bit of an arc to what we're trying to accomplish today. What Gavin has presented is essentially a change. Of course, this was called changes. He reported on the changes that we understand in the global mean over time, so looked at these secular changes in the climate system. And what Richard and I would like to do in these latter two talks is talk about extremes and changes in extremes. I'm going to take the temperature component, so I'll talk about changes in temperature extremes that have both been observed and what we expect in the future. And then Richard will finish up with hydrological extremes, and so talk about the kinds of changes that we expect with regard to moisture in the climate system. So that's the roadmap and the idea behind the arc. And so, as I said, I'm going to take temperature extremes. And of course, what Gavin has already presented sets me up very well to do this. And so I'm going to start where everybody starts when they talk about temperature extremes in the climate system, which is steroids in baseball. So the reason why I want to talk about this, and the reason why people often talk about steroids in baseball when they discuss extremes in temperature or extremes in the climate system over time is because it's an apt example, and it's a useful way of discussing these. I'm going to torture it even more than normal today and just set you up for thinking about how to conceptualize changes in temperature extremes within the climate system, both in terms of what we've observed and how they're moving forward. So if you're a commissioner who cares about steroids in baseball, you can imagine doing a few different things to try to decide whether or not it's a problem and it exists within your players. What would you imagine doing? All right, how would you imagine testing whether or not this is something that's occurring? And the first thing I would say is that you could drug test your players. All right, and we haven't talked about causes behind some of these changes, but of course lying behind a lot of the discussion we're having today is the cause in the changes that we're observing in the climate system, which, I'm not going to spoil the ending here, for many of us, or what's been determined time and time again, is the increases in greenhouse gases that have accumulated in the atmosphere over the last century and are expected to continue through the 21st. And so one of the ways that you can think about this example is you could go and test your players for steroids. And similarly in the climate system, we could go out and look for the causes that we would expect to be causing these changes. And we've done that in broad scale. So one of the ways of thinking about this analogy is going out, measuring the things that we recognize are changing, that we recognize would cause the kinds of temperature changes in temperature extremes to be occurring in the climate system. And if we found steroids in our players or increases in CO2 in the atmosphere, we can associate those changes with those changes in atmospheric constituents, the cause, with what we're observing as well in the climate system. The other way, of course, of doing this is to look at statistics. And one of the great things about baseball is that they've been keeping statistics for over a century now, and there's a lot to look at. And so when you think about extremes, one of the useful ways of thinking about this is with regard to home run statistics in baseball. All right, and so the way to imagine this is imagine some of your players start using steroids, getting stronger, hitting the ball harder. What kinds of statistics could you look at to determine whether or not this is a widespread problem within the league? And so this is just an example of where someone has done that. And there's a couple ways to think about this. One is to just look at home run statistics over time. So this is home runs since 1960, moving forward through to 2006. These are the number of players with home runs over 45. Okay, so you can see these bar graphs here, going back into 1960, mid-20s. And you can look at the numbers increase as you move into what this particular author calls the steroid era. But you can see this significant increase in the number of home runs that occurred during this period of time. And you can imagine that as being a measure of this influence of steroids on the league and how players are hitting. Now, there might be other things like rule changes and so on, but you can make a strong argument that something happened here in the way that in the number of balls that were being hit out of the park, and as an indication of the use of steroids within the game. I should say that the reason why this is important is because you're looking, similar to what Gavin talked about in terms of spatial variability and noise, is at any given time if a player like Barry Bonds hits a ball out of the park, it doesn't mean that's because he's taking steroids. It, of course, is something that was possible without them, but if you look at the statistics in aggregate, if you look at the individual players or the numbers for the entire league, this kind of a signal begins to jump out and you can see it. Now, another way of thinking about this is through probability distribution. So the other thing that this particular author has done is looked at the expected number of balls hit a certain distance. So this axis here is range in meters, 0 meters up through, this is the threshold for home runs. And there's two different distributions on here. There's a red distribution and a blue distribution. And the red distribution is this author's estimate of the distances of the balls that are hit. Of course, there are many balls. Some go out of the park, some don't. But the distance of the balls hit if you increase the velocities by 4% in all cases. And what you can see is the number of balls that were hit out of the park for this case where the balls were being hit slower is around 10% of this particular distribution. And for the number that was hit with the increase in velocities, it increases to 16.6%. So roughly a 66% increase in the number of home runs that were hit. All right? And I want you to think about this distribution because it's very useful for thinking about how we consider extremes within the climate system and how we approach many extreme events. In this case, we're going to be thinking about temperature and temperature extremes. All right? So that's the analogy I want you to keep in mind. And now I want to talk more specifically about extremes within the climate system. So there's different ways that you can get more extremes, all right? And again, we're talking specifically about temperature in this case. But the way I want you to think about this is just a typical bell curve, all right, with a mean at the peak. And then what we would call, if this is temperature along this axis, what we would call warm extremes might occur up here in the tail of the distribution, and the cold extremes would occur down here in the lower part of the distribution. Now, when we talk about standard deviations, all right, usually as we march up this tail, it represents fewer and fewer possibilities of getting those extremes on each side of the distribution. So we usually talk about one standard deviation about the mean, as including roughly 66% of the variance. As we go up to 2, roughly 95. So these extremes exist on the tails as only 5% of the occurrences that you would expect. Okay? So if this is your original distribution, like temperature, all right, say globally at a given location, you can imagine increasing the number of extremes that you get on the warm end. So this tail in the original distribution is just this part of the pie, or this slice. But as you increase the mean, if you take this distribution and you increase the mean, all of a sudden what you called the threshold for your extreme and the number of events it contained in the small part of the distribution now includes this much larger part. So one way of getting more warm extremes in the climate system is simply by increasing the mean. And Gavin very convincingly showed how we are increasing the mean both globally and in specific locations. And that, for temperature, is a very useful way of thinking about how we increase extremes. You'll also notice that we've reduced the cold extremes. So in the increase of this distribution, we've moved this tail out of the area that we would have considered very cold extremes. All right? So in that case, we've increased the number of warm extremes, reduced the number of cold extremes. Well, we can do other things with this distribution too. We can squash it down. So again, this is our original distribution. We can squash it down and increase the length of the tails on either side. In this case, what we've done, again, here is the original number of, say, hot days or hot weather and the number of cold weather. And as we've increased the distribution and made the tails to lay farther out, we've increased now, if you look at the area under the curve, we've increased the number of events occurring within those extremes as well. And we've done it symmetrically. So we've now, in this case, increased the number of cold events, reduce the number of, and increase the number of warm events. And I should say the other important thing here is that within these distributions, look at the dark reds and dark blues here. These are extremes that would have never been possible in the previous climate. So see how the distribution only goes up to here roughly. This part of the distribution that we now include in the shifted distribution, whether we've changed the mean or increased the variance, now exists in a case where those are extreme or temperatures that are warm or cold in a scenario that we would have never expected to have given that previous distribution. All right? And then, of course, what we can do with these two different cases is put them together, where we have both a mean shift and a variance shift, which in the case of, say, a warmer climate, includes now even more extreme events lying above that part in the distribution that we previously thought of as the cutoff for our extremes. All right? And in many cases, depending on the extremes you're talking about, you're doing one or both of these things. All right? And so in terms of temperature, one of the easiest things to think about is, again, this changing mean. It's something that Gavin went through and talked about. And it's a very straightforward response to what you would expect in a changing climate if you did nothing else from the distribution. So one of the nice things about temperature extremes, it's very easily to conceptualize just through a changing mean in the climate, just through a forcing that would cause the climate to gradually warm over time. Even if you keep the same distribution, you would expect to see an increase in temperature extremes because you've shifted the mean of the distribution. All right? And so this is very consistent with the idea of global warming, with what we'd expect in a warming climate. And one of the things that we can do now, just like steroids in baseball and looking at home run statistics, we can go into the climate system, look at observations, and see if there's evidence for changes in these extreme events in various locations about the world. So a canonical example of this, of course, is the European heat wave in 2003. Some of you may remember this event. Was anyone in Europe at the time? Anyone? So a few of you. Was it hot? All right, it was a warm summer, a very warm summer, several standard deviations above the long-term mean. So this is the Central Europe June, July, August temperature. So we're looking at summer temperatures now. This is going back to about the mid-1700s, and you can see how those summer temperatures vary over time. And this is the 2003 event. All right, so it was a very warm event. This is, of course, just in, as a measure in Central Europe, but all over Europe at the time when it was a very warm summer. And In this particular summary, the IPCC, I hope many of you probably are aware of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but of course it represents this consortium of scientists who look at the field of climate science every 5 to 7 years, make an assessment about the state of the science, and these were the statements they made about that particular heat wave in 2003 in Europe, calling it both the hottest summer since 1780, where they were using these actual observational records, but then they also said it was the hottest since at least 1500 based on natural archives, that, what we call paleoclimate archives, that preserve records of past change. I can update that today with a paper that's actually in preparation that I'm working on with my European colleagues, where we've done reconstructions now back over 2,000 years. So this is going back to prior to the turn of the first, well, back to 1 AD and a little bit beforehand, up through 2000. Here is that European summer temperature, and it still remains the warmest temperature in this estimate back over 2,000 years, so back to Roman times. You can also, there's some interesting things in this curve showing that the Roman times were actually quite warm. The period we know as the medieval climate anomaly was also quite warm. But even against those background periods, 2003 stands out as the warmest summer temperature recorded in these proxies over that time interval. The other thing that you should note is this is very consistent with the way that we talked about these distributions generally. So what this is showing is the distribution of summer temperatures between 1961 and 1990 in blue. All right, the frequency of temperatures. This is summer, June, July, August temperature distribution. And this is the distribution for that summer temperature, for those summer temperatures in 2003 in Europe. And you can very much see that distributional shift in the mean, in particular in Europe during that summer, and it's very consistent with the way that we would think about these extremes. So most of the summer, the average of the summer was very close to 1 or 2 standard deviations already above the long-term mean distribution. So a significant part of the entire summer was well above the mean, and in many cases above the warmest temperatures that had been recorded in Europe at the time. So it was a big event. I like to appeal to the IPCC in terms of summarizing some of these observations and extreme events, because at the end of the day, I'm just one schmuck who's standing up here and talking to you about things from my perspective. But what this really represents is a collective synthesis of the science as it stands every 5 to 7 years. And I think it's worth reading these statements because it really does represent a wide consensus on what we know about extremes and what we understand about them. So this is their statement in 2007. There'll be a new report coming out next year, but this is the synthesis as it stood in 2007. Changes in extremes of temperatures are also consistent with warming of the climate. Again, this idea that I've already presented. A widespread reduction in the number of frost days in mid-latitude regions, an increase in the number of warm extremes, and a reduction in the number of daily cold extremes are observed in 70 to 75% of the land regions where data are available. The most marked changes are for cold, so that low end of the distribution, the lowest 10% based on the 6190 mean nights, which have become rarer over the 51 to 2003 period. So cold nights have become much rarer, and warm nights have become much more frequent. All right, the highest 10% of those distributions. So again, very consistent with this idea and the shift of the distribution, what we would expect under these warming scenarios. So if we take a global view of this, there's different ways that this can be mapped. Now, Gavin has already shown you anomalies. So this is, again, are those spatial maps of anomalies, but in this case it's just June, July, August temperatures, all right, with a base period of 1951 to 1980. And what these maps are doing is stepping through the years. This is 1955, 65, 75, and then these are the last several years. So it's 06, 07, 08, 09, 2010, and 2011. And what is being plotted is the temperature anomalies relative to that base period. And if you just look at the way this is going, you're of course seeing many more red periods representing the warmer periods on these scales. And note these are actually different scalings here. But the point is that the regions are getting warmer relative to that historical mean. All right, so that's something that Gavin already showed you. But now if you think about these distributions, you think in terms of standard deviations, I think it's a very interesting plot to look at when you look at the same maps, all right, but what these colors now represent is the numbers of standard deviations above the long-term mean that exist, all right? So what these represent is, as you go up in numbers here from 2 to 3 and so on, the number of standard deviations that you're stepping out on that distribution, that probability distribution. And what this is showing is that in most cases, the warm temperatures that are being seen are statistically what you would be very rare statistically what you would expect from this earlier distribution. So that these are things that you would not expect to see without a shift in the distribution. If we just assume that historical distribution, these are events, warming events at all these locations that you would not expect to be seeing otherwise. All right? And you can see, I mean, this is a scary progression in terms of the standard deviations away from that long-term mean that we would expect. So I want to finally say something about the future. So Gavin talked about what the observations are. Of course, that's what I've been doing. I want to just show you a couple estimates of how we expect things to change into the future. So these are the distributions for the first, well, from 2020 to 2029, and then the distribution at the end of the 21st century in the global mean for different scenarios. All right? So these scenarios represent different assumptions about the choices we're going to make as societies, how much greenhouse, how we're going to change our mix of energy and so on. But what they all show is if you accept this as an initial distribution within the century, this increase in the mean, and also a tendency towards warmer events later, higher up on the distribution. All right, so that's again consistent with what we've already talked about. But now this is an interesting map showing how the summers are expected to change by looking at the number of events that are above any previous warm temperatures relative to the baseline. All right, so what 100% represents here is the number of days that are warmer than any other temperature that had been seen that summer in the distribution. So what it's saying is that large parts of the land masses, 100% of the summer events are warmer than what we would have called the most extreme events previously. All right, so this again is a measure of what we expect to see in the changes and how we're expecting to move into a regime that in many cases, in terms of extreme events, are things that we haven't even seen yet. So this is the tail end of the distribution that's getting above all of those extreme events that we previously had experience for, which were already way out on the distribution. These are things that don't even exist at this point on the distributions. All right, so it's a sobering idea in terms of what our adaptation is going to need to look like, what we're used to presently, and what these extremes will look like moving into the end of the century. And finally, I just want to leave with a couple thoughts of why we care. All right, so we've looked very specifically at temperature extremes, and in some cases, they get short shrift to things like cyclones and other maybe more immediately catastrophic events. But if you actually look at the impacts that temperature extremes have on societies, they are numerous and in some cases more destructive when you add them all up. So of course there are health impacts. Warm summers of course impact disproportionately the elderly and people without access to summer shelters, etc. So these have, as I mentioned with the European heat wave, the reported deaths associated with that 2003 heat wave are around 70,000. So a lot of people die during these very extreme events. Of course, infrastructure damages, when we think about sustainability and moving forward, making ourselves more resilient to the changes that we expect to happen. Transportation can be affected, roads buckle, train lines kink, airports close because airplanes can't get as much lift in warm weather. If you don't believe me, try flying out of Phoenix in late summer, where they do have fairly consistent airport closures. Higher demand for energy, power line sag can cause power outages, etc. Water resources are stressed as, for instance, infrastructure that's susceptible to heat has to be watered down to maintain colder temperatures, like bridges that are susceptible to these things. Forest fires, of course, are susceptible to both hydrological change as well as temperature change, but we certainly will expect more of these moving forward. It's something that we've already seen. And then agriculture is, of course, also affected. Livestock mortality. Animals are people too, of course, and they're affected in the same way that many humans are to these extreme temperatures. And one of the most disconcerting things is crop yields. It's been, I think, worked out over the last several years that many crops can be fairly drought resistant. Of course, droughts include both precip and temperature effects, but there's certain things that are grown, for instance, in the tropics that just don't have much room to go in terms of how they will respond to very warm temperatures, and it's expected that crop yields will certainly fall and mortality will be the consequence of some of these more extreme temperatures, particularly in the tropics moving into the 21st century. So those are things to think about. Oh, and I should just say it's going to cost us a lot too. Of course, this includes many things as far as weather disasters are concerned, but these are the number of events over time back to 1980 up through present day, of the number of events costing the U.S. over $1 billion. You can see this trend just like the temperature data. This is inflation adjusted, and it is something that's going to cost us more as we move into these more extreme environments. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Richard, and Peter, are you going to introduce him again? I think we're supposed to wait for questions until the end.
This is just a technical question. How do people get data on those remote parts of the Pacific Ocean? Like, where are you getting those temperatures from, basically?
It's for me? Yeah, well, I mean, these nowadays a lot of them come from satellite observations, but historically they came from ship observations, which ship observations were routinized beginning in 1856 by the European and American navies. So now it's augmented by satellites, and also we have all sorts of other buoys out there and so on. So that data's pretty good.
And girls.
I think he said boys.
Right.
In the year 2006, Al Gore warned that we had a 10-year window to make changes before climate change becomes irreversible. Do you think that was an alarmist claim, or do you agree with him?
No, just, you can chime in. So for all intents and purposes, climate change is irreversible. I mean, we've already passed that point. We're not going to see a climate like the 1950s again. None of us are going to see that. What we've done to Arctic ice, for instance, we're not going to recover that. So the timescales that politicians use when they say these kinds of things, we have 4 years to act, we have 10 years to act. What they're trying to express is that there's a lot of inertia in the system, right? We haven't caught up. The climate hasn't caught up with things that we put into the atmosphere 10 or 20 years ago. Right? So right now we're storing up problems because the planet as a whole is still catching up. And if we keep moving the goalposts, right, the planet has more to catch up to. So when you go forward with those projections and you say, okay, well, how long does it take to, rearrange your energy supply? How long does it take to, change all the things that we're doing that are contributing to this? It's a long time, right? It's 20, 30, 40, 50 years for all of that infrastructure to get changed, adapted, replaced. And so if you don't start soon, then what you end up with is you're building in emissions into the system that, in 10 years' time, we'll be stuck with, right? And so the more that we invest in, fossil fuel delivery systems and infrastructure that relies on fossil fuels particularly, then, we're just building in more and more emissions for the future, and so a larger and larger impact by the time we get out to 2030, 2050, 2100. So it's not that anything terrible is going to particularly happen in 2016 or 2014 or something. I mean, I'm sure terrible things will happen in those years, but I don't think they'll be related to anything Al Gore was talking about. But there's a timescale for policies that are needed in order to prevent much larger changes going on in the future. And that's really the problem here. The problem is if it was a thing that, well, we have to act now because there's something terrible going to happen tomorrow, right, then people would do it. It would be an acute problem. It would be like the asteroid coming and it's going to destroy us. Okay, we would mobilize, we would do everything in our power to stop that happening. But what we're talking about here is much more of a chronic problem, right? It's something that is going to get worse and worse and worse and worse, but every year it's just going to get a little bit more worse. Right?
May I add to that?
No, sure.
I think the other challenge, there's often discussions about dangerous levels of carbon dioxide, and sometimes these discussions are couched in that people talk about 350, 450. What's a threshold that we should be targeting? And I think it's useful to think about targets as spurring actions. But the other thing that is difficult to quantify, and I think one of the reasons why this is a really difficult question, is there are parts of the climate system that work like dials. So as we turn up the CO2, we could potentially go back to where we were if we turned it back down. And there are a lot of things that work like thresholds. And so one of the scary things about understanding what dangerous levels of CO2 might be is quantifying those thresholds. We know there are feedbacks in the climate system that once we pass a certain threshold, no matter what we do, we're going to be on a trajectory where the climate system takes over and may go into a completely different state. The problem is it's very hard to predict where those thresholds lie. And so there's certainly a conservative principle that I think we should all apply, which is I think we can all agree we don't want to go past some of these thresholds, like melting enough permafrost where we start emitting enough methane into the atmosphere that, all of a sudden that signal becomes significant, or where we melt the ice caps back far enough where regardless of what happens, they will continue to melt because of the feedbacks involved there. And so, this issue of thresholds is one of the things that we have the least that we have our fingers on the least in terms of quantifying and understanding where exactly those might be, but they could be some of the largest impacts, and we just don't know where we cross those in the climate system at this point. We know they exist, but we don't know exactly where the CO2 level is that would put us past those.
My understanding is that there are some effects that are like multipliers and basically become vicious circles, like, for example, the warming of the oceans and things like that. Can you talk about those things where they actually just compound and they're pretty much unstoppable? Kind of like going back to the previous question, but specifically, I guess, talking about the oceans when they warm up, what effects they have with the reflection of the heat and all that.
Well, I'll give you just a couple of quick examples, and the rest of the panel can weigh in. So these are feedbacks, is what we're talking about, and there can be positive or negative feedbacks, things that either enhance the degree of change or feedback to reduce the degree of change. And a couple of positive feedbacks that we think about are what we call the ice albedo feedback. So as we melt ice in the polar regions, that when it's there acts like a big mirror. So it reflects a lot of the incoming sunlight, and as a result, we don't absorb that energy, and that energy then isn't used to warm the planet. When we melt the ice and replace it with dark ocean waters, we now absorb a lot more of that incident solar energy, and as a result, enhance the warming that occurs. So that's one. Clouds are another big question. Clouds can actually work as positive or negative feedbacks, and one of the challenges is that they're some of the hardest things to model in the climate system, and there's been a lot of research done in how to incorporate cloud changes into climate models and how they might change into the future. But to be honest, that's one of the areas that we still don't have a complete understanding of how clouds will change. And I should say, the way they work is they can reflect more sunlight. So depending on the kinds of clouds you have, you might reflect more sunlight if you're forming more clouds into a warming planet. But they also can absorb long-wave radiation and work to further warm the planet. And so the balance of that moving forward is something that we're still working out. Do you guys want to add to feedbacks?
Yes, I mean, there's lots of these different kind of amplifying factors. This isn't the same as something going completely out of control, like a feedback on a mic or something. We're not, these things amplify the change, but they don't take it into some huge new state. And we're not going to end up living on planet Venus, at least not for another 5 billion years or so. So, these amplifiers get talked about a lot, like the methane from permafrost gets talked about a lot, but it would really need to warm a lot before we thought that was going to be a big player in what's happening. I mean, there are carbon cycle feedbacks, so as the temperatures warm, it's harder to dissolve carbon dioxide in the ocean, and that's where it's all going to end up eventually, and so that leaves more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, so that's a slight amplifier. But they're part of the system, and we need to be paying attention to them. But they're not the difference between us being here and then us going off like that. I mean, all of those things that you're seeing, the trends that you're seeing, all of those include a certain degree of amplification from the factors that we've already talked about.
Yeah, I mean, the feedbacks related to sea ice, water vapor, clouds, are of course within the climate models whose results we were presenting from today. So the methane one, or carbon cycle feedbacks, probably aren't, but all the feedbacks that we consider to be the most important are in there. So they aren't. None of them are causing a runaway situation.
You displayed a graph of the Canadian temperature changes that was hiding data. Was it a political graph, or is it reflecting the fact that in Canada it's a very conservative government and they're trying to promote tar sands and pipelines and such? Or is it?
So that was in the National Post. If you know the National Post, I mean it's a kind of Wall Street Journal wannabe, along with the Wall Street Journal's peculiar take on the world from their op-ed page. So they're trying to have their own peculiar take. So it's very much a political newspaper. But always has been, and it's not related particularly to the current Canadian government's stances, though I'm sure that they support that.